I'm Brian Mwemba. Welcome to this lecture on Introduction to the World Trade Organization. I'm the Senior Documentation Information Officer from Zambia Bureau of Standards. So our actually lecture for this day, we quickly look at the World Trade Organization in detail. In the first instance, we look at the module objective or objectives in place that we've actually aligned for this training. Number one is to explain the objectives, functions, principles, and organizational structure of the WTO, including the role of the TBT committee within the framework of the WTO. Then we'll look at also the part of introducing the World Trade Organization agreements and describe how the TBT agreement is integrated in the WTO legal framework. The module content, because as we are starting, we need to understand or have an overview of what is contained in our lecture. So the first part that we'll look at is actually introduction to the World Trade Organization. The second part will be what the World Trade Organization is, then objectives of the World Trade Organization, functions of the World Trade Organization, then the structure of the WTO. Then we'll also go further to look at the principles of the TBT or the WTO and the TBT framework in the WTO. Unit 2, because we already covered the other part. It's in terms of introducing the World Trade Organization. What is it? Many people may talk about what other agencies are, but here we need to understand what the WTO is. Okay? In terms of organization, we may say it's an international organization with about 160 member countries. It was established in 1995, located in Europe, to be specific, Geneva, Switzerland. And actually, for your own information, Zambia actually became part or joined the WTO upon inception in 1995. Right. The other part that we look at is the World Organization is the only global international organization which deals with multilateral rules of international trade between actually member nations or member states, so to speak. So when you look at it being a global, it has quite a number of agreements and also a number of disciplines in which actually different bodies, different committees sit to ensure that actually international trade is promoted among member states. Number one, we look at objectives of the WTO. As we continue, one aspect is to improve the welfare of its member countries. That's standards of living, providing employment, increase in terms of income, etc., etc., by expanding the production of and trade in goods and services. For your own information, actually, in terms of provision of employment, the World Trade Organization actually is an institution that has brought about a level playing field in terms of employment opportunities for its members. Any member states can actually, member states are people who can say maybe citizens of a particular country, as long as you're a member of the World Trade Organization, actually you are free to participate or to apply in any position that has been advertised by the World Trade Organization. And actually this in terms of employment provision is actually in terms of transparency, and actually it's well advertised to the interest of everyone to apply as long as they are coming from member states. Okay, we look at the functions. Number one function of the World Trade Organization is to administer trade agreements. As you'll be able to see as we go on, you find that the WTO actually has quite a number of trade agreements that member states actually are involved in terms of reviews, in terms of application overviews. There are quite a number of these agreements. Okay, the same WTO actually serves as a forum for trade negotiations. For example, a lot of different ministerial conferences in terms of trade negotiations actually have taken place over the years, and so the WTO provides actually a framework, or it provides actually space for member countries to debate and negotiate trade requirements. Could be within member states, within maybe trading blocks that actually is done at the WTO as well. Then we look at the issue of settlement of trade disputes. The World Trade Organization actually provides also a platform for members actually to have their disputes heard within the framework of the World Trade Organization. Right. Then, in terms of review of members' trade policies, the WTO as well provides actually a framework. It provides space actually to ensure that member states' trade policies are reviewed in order to ensure that they provide a level playing field in terms of international trade. Then the other aspect that is actually key to the World Trade Organization is to ensure that there is promotes it cooperates within or with other international organizations. For example, it could be UNCTAD, it could be ITC. They provide actually that collabo between the World Trade Organization and the other international agencies actually under the UN, in order just to ensure that there is that cooperation also that is trickled to member states. Could be sometimes in terms of technical assistance. Right. We continue with what the WTO is, ways or what it's up to. We can simply say that it sets out legal ground rules for international commerce, which is international trade, where all member states actually have to actually abide by. These rules actually are contracts guaranteeing member countries important trade actually rights. In case other members may not be very sure of certain trade rights that they have, this body actually will be able to give an overview of what's due to each and every member state. They also actually bind governments to keep their trade policies within the agreed actual limits. For example, if you notify and ratify me, for example, a notification is sent to WTO, and also the policies come into effect, the institution actually ensures that actually member states actually work out or maybe operate within the framework of the agreed policies as actually notified to the WTO once they come into force. Agreements under the World Trade Organization, we can say that 13, if not more, at the moment, 13 agreements that are binding to all member states within the WTO. The agreements govern regulations of safety and quality of goods in international trade. These are covered actually. They will include agreements, for example, that apply to the SPS agreement, phytosanitary measures, agreements on TBT, which is agreement on the technical barriers to trade. These are some of the agreements actually which actually are found within the World Trade Organization. Okay, both actually are agreements that I've pointed alluded to earlier on. They both try to identify how to meet the needs to apply standards and at the same time avoid actually protectionist measures in terms of disguising these actual measures. It should actually promote a clear, open, level playing field within these two agreements. For example, I would say some acronyms that are quite very pronounced at the World Trade Organization. We may say here the SPS, which is phytosanitary and measures, or animal health, plant health, and food safety. then we may say that members can implement SPS measures actually resulting from science-based risk assessments, because SPS measures actually in terms of any trade dispute, these actually measures actually should be proven scientifically with actually a backed actually in terms of assessment or a review, or in terms of maybe analysis which has been performed by particular member states, and analysis to ensure that once these measures are put forth, they are credible and they'll be able actually not to bring trade challenges. These measures actually additionally must not discriminate between regions and domestic products, posing the same risk. When it comes also to the other acronym, which is the TBT, this talks about actually trade barriers, okay, which is actually broader than actually the SPS agreement. If you may like to understand that way, it is quite broader than the SPS agreement, right? Then we look at the structure of the World Trade Organization. Sometimes we may actually want to have a critical overview or critical understanding of what the WTO is. So there's a structure that is there, which elements or which bodies fall under which area, so that at least as you actually interact or as you go through the measures or want to understand more about the World Trade Organization, the structure will be able to guide you actually before you even maybe visit the institution physically. You'll be able to understand from the structure. WTO members established a working structure. This is actually a concerted effort by members. It was not by one man, so maybe one member state to spearhead, but this is a member-driven actually structure, which is to allow members to monitor the implementation and the development of the WTO. It shows, it could be in a chart that could maybe be given in the following slide. You'll be able to see actually how it's structured in terms of pictorial or in terms of a chart. The SPS-related work in the WTO as well takes place in the SPS committee. This is like part of the structure. There's SPS committee within the WTO, which responds directly to the Council for Goods, for trading goods, I mean. So the meetings of the SPS committee are open to all WTO members, actually other governments and international bodies with observer member status actually may be part and parcel of these actually meetings that take place within the SPS committee. Right. The SPS meetings are held 3 times in a year to ensure that at least there's that openness within each member state. Looking at the structure for the World Trade Organization, number one, at the apex there, we have what we call the Ministerial Conference at the apex. Then we have also there the General Council, where actually a number of actually councils actually report to or fall under. We have, for example, there under the General Council, there is what we call the Council for Trade in Goods, trade in goods in there. Then we also have Council for Trade-related aspects of the intellectual property rights. Okay, then we also have the Council for Trade in Services. For example, like in Zambia, we have this Council of Trade in Services, where one of our major institutions, which is PACRA, which is actually into regulating the patents, company registration, actually falls under. And also, like down there, we have what we call from the Council for Trade in Goods, there are a number of committees, okay, market access, agriculture, the SPS there, which falls under the Council for Trade in Goods. Then we have also the TBT committee. And actually, for information, the TBT framework in Zambia falls under the Ministry of Commerce, or under the mandate of the Ministry of Commerce, Trade and Industry. Within that, there is also a TBT committee, which actually is sitting, or which sits at the Ministry of Commerce, with its actually secretariat being held by the Zambia Bureau of Standards. This is the area which actually looks at the notifications that are actually posted in by other member states. They are reviewed using through the TBT committee, and also if in case there's any challenge, the information is actually provided as feedback to member states depending on the actually system that is used. Sometimes in terms of notifications, what can be used actually is the online system to ensure that the feedback in terms of Zambia actually wanting actually other member states to understand what is coming actually ahead of them in terms of proposed notifications. There could be an online system that actually we usually use. And then when it comes on the other side, there's also the General Council, okay, to assist in terms of dispute settlement body. This is where actually the part in terms of dispute settlement aspects within actually the WTO actually are being heard on or heard through. There's also the Council of meeting in terms of trade policy review mechanism or body that also comes through the General Council there. There's also the appellate body, which is the dispute settlement actually unit, which ensures that there's a proper mechanism in terms of actually undertaking these disputes that are brought in by member states. So holistically, when you look at all these other actually angles or arms of the WTO, they actually ensure that a proper level playing field actually is attained by all member states in just one part of ensuring that trade promotions actually in terms of international are actually in the right order. Right. So as we go on, in case there will be any concerns, I will be able actually to address them. So at the moment, I will continue. Thank you so much. Right. We are now going to look at actually the basic principles actually of the World Trade Organization. As you know that each and every institution or organization, it could be maybe a local entity, a government institution, for example, in Zambia, there should be actually rules actually that govern that particular institution to ensure that there's a systematic way of actually operating or systematic operations. For example, here we say the World Trade Organization actually has these actually basic principles. We look at number one, the most favored nation, national actually principle. We also look at the national treatment principle, and we also look at the other cardinal principle, which is transparency in terms of trade promotions, trade provisions. And when you look at all these principles, actually are what bring about the WTO existence in the way of actually conducting trade. So let's actually pay particular attention for us to understand these principles so that we work within the framework of the World Trade Organization. These three principles are the most fundamental principles of the World Trade Organization. They are all designed to establish and maintain non-discrimination, to ensure that there's openness in terms of international trade, in terms of actually the market aspects of trade. They promote that kind of aspect. Right. We start with the national treatment. The national treatment actually is regarded as one of the cornerstones of the WTO. It's considered, I repeat myself, is considered as one of actually the cornerstone of the World Trade Organization. Requires national treatment with respect to all the laws that actually govern trade within a particular country, inclusive of regulations and requirements affecting the internal sales, offering for sale, purchase, transportation, and also distribution or use of imported goods. So this covers all these actually aspects. Okay. We continue with national treatment principle. It's actually mainly meant to maintain a competitive equality between domestic products and enterprises, On the other hand, actually, it also ensures that it takes into consideration those of other member states on the other hand. So it's not only for the interest of the local enterprises, but it also takes into account actually those of other members of the World Trade Organization. Application of this principle varies according to whatever it applies. Okay, for example, it applies to trading goods, trading services, or it covers the aspect of the intellectual property rights. So it's not actually one-sided. It focuses actually on all these three aspects: trading goods, trading services, intellectual property rights. For example, you want to trade under a particular name, you have to have actually the right to do that. You want maybe, for example, I'll give a practical example here in terms of ISO standards. Maybe a particular country want to adopt ISO standards. There are certain actual requirements that a member should be able to follow in order to adopt these international standards. Trading services, it could be exportation of human resource, that is covered as well. Trading goods, it could be consumable products. This principle actually also covers that aspect. Okay, the NTM actually principle is meant to establish a level playing field, as alluded earlier on, between domestic and foreign products and enterprises, not only the local, not only the imported products, but it covers all these aspects to ensure that member states of the World Trade Organization are able to benefit as they trade actually equally. The requirements affecting the sale of products can be different for an imported and a local or locally produced goods, as long as they are not applied so to afford protection to the domestic industry. So meaning that imported products actually should be accorded as well just the same platform, the same actually level playing field as the local products actually accorded to. That's what this principle actually also is promoting. Okay. We look at now the other principle, which is actually the most favored nations, the most favored nation principle. This principle actually requires that a member should be accorded, or we can just maybe simply say, actually, this principle actually requires that a member accord goods and services of another member state not less favorable than that it accords to its goods and services, or goods and services of another member state. For example, I'll allude to this example. In Zambia, we have, for example, a standard for bottled water, or let's say a regulation that has been now that is now into effect on bottled water. The provisions on the local scenario is that this particular product is being actually monitored by what we call the Zambia Compulsory Standards Agency, which is a body or it's an institution that falls under the Ministry of Commerce, Trade and Industry, meaning that once this particular product is actually being actually maybe inspected in terms of conformity assessment requirements, the same actually should be applied to imported products of like still maybe mineral water coming from a different a country or another member state of the World Trade Organization. The same principle that actually is applied for the local product in terms of conformity assessment requirements or procedures should also be accorded to the other one, other than favoring the local aspect. And actually, I can testify that this is what is happening actually currently in Zambia. We ensure that the products that are brought in or being imported to the country are treated actually equally with the ones which we have actually locally. This principle also applies in the area of intellectual property rights, or intellectual property, as alluded to earlier on, is designed actually to guarantee in terms of equal competitive conditions between goods and services of different actually trading partners. So it also provides that competitive advantage in terms of services and the like, to ensure that there is no discrimination in that part. If an imported service has to come into the country, what is already administered as domestic, the domestic market should be the same in terms of application to this, to ensure that there is that a level playing field. Okay, then also the same principle, which is the MFN principle, it covers imported like products from any WTO member country. Also, it also covers other states that are not members of the World Trade Organization. So in other ways, actually, this principle is encouraging other member states to join that are not members of the World Trade Organization as well, to be part of the World Trade Organization, because this is an extended arm. They may not be members of the World Trade Organization, but at the end of the day, they are able to benefit from this principle, meaning there's a lot more that these other members, the other countries that are not members of the World Trade Organization, can benefit once they join or they actually ratify to the World Trade Organization. When it comes to the aspect of transparency, this is another principle, the third one of the WTO. We can say this principle actually is in two parts. We can say the first part is that the obligations imposed on members is to ensure that they publish or make publicly available all relevant regulations before application. The requirements of the second partial administration of such regulations and other rights is to review the decision taken under them. So, as you can see, the first part actually is ensuring that there's that part of transparency in the way institutions are providing information, in the way the institutions actually are putting into force their technical regulations, meaning there should be actually a clear-cut picture that other member states actually should be able to anticipate what's forthcoming. For example, if Zambia wants, when Zambia was actually putting up a regulation on bottled water, the key aspect was, number one, within the local scenario, we had to ensure that the concerned stakeholders were part and parcel of that process. Then from there, we had to ensure that at the end of the day, before it came into force, this notification, or this actually proposed technical regulation at that time, was notified to the World Trade Organization, where other member states actually have the right, or had the right at that particular time, actually to comment, either to object, depending on their side of views, or maybe on the side of the analysis that this actual regulation would actually bring on board in terms of trade measures. So in that part, that's the route that Zambia took in terms of promoting transparency in terms of actually trade requirements, as also required by the WTO. Right, we'll continue. So this part is to ensure that requirements that members give notice in terms of governmental actions or to the WTO and other member states. This just simply means that there is that deliberate issue to notify the World Trade Organization of the measures that a particular member state would want to put, so that there is that clarity, other than pushing up measures without notifying. When a member state want to trade maybe against the other member that has actually put up a measure, it becomes like something that's more like a surprise, which is not supposed to be actually on the platform of the World Trade Organization, because as we alluded to earlier on, the main focal point of establishing the World Trade Organization is to promote trade and also to ensure that the rules that govern trade are actually on the level playing field. Right. This principle also serves as a basis for a rule-oriented foreign. Okay, I may simply say it is actually a principle that promotes foreign trade policy for maintaining stability and predictability of the trade law regulations of other member states. So it simply shows that transparency is very key in terms of the legal framework of the World Trade Organization. So every member or each member should ensure that before actually enacting or putting into force any trade regulation, there should be that transparency of notifying other member states to ensure that there are no surprises in trade. As we can only say, surprises may come in weddings and other places, but in terms of trade, surprises should not be there. There should be that just clear level playing field for all member states. The WTO principles, now we are looking at the due process of the law. In terms of the due process and the requirements, it requires that requirements of transparent governmental processes is an important part of the aspect of due law process. As you can know that quite a number of trade laws that the WTO has put across. So simply meaning that even when putting up the transparent mechanisms, the trade policies, the trade laws that are set by other member states, there should be that recognizance of the laws and the procedures that the World Trade Organization has actually set aside for all member states actually to follow. A close related principle is a procedural due process principle presented in the WTO as a dispute settlement procedures. For example, in case of any dispute settlement mechanism or any dispute case that has been brought about by members, the due process of the law actually is applied in the dispute settlement procedure under the dispute settlement unit as well. The procedures for dispute settlement at the WTO actually, as alluded earlier on, just to echo it out again, are actually for the understanding on the rules and procedures governing the settlement of disputes under this, which is can be maybe abbreviated as the DSU. The process continues, especially in terms of significant articles or Article 11 of the DSU, which provides that a panel should take an objective assessment of the matter before it, including the objectives, providing assessments of the facts of the case and applicability and the conformity with the relevant covered agreements. For example, in terms of dispute settlements, in terms of case hearings at the World Trade Organization, there is actually also a transparent way of doing things. Because if a case is taken to the WTO or a dispute between member states, it is ensured that the due process in terms of understanding which actually trade agreement has a particular member state defaulted against, and also what is the objective of that, so that at the end of the day, in terms of dispute settlement, there's a clear-cut actually overview or clear-cut judgment in terms of bringing out what would be the best for each party that is concerned, and also to bring the best recognition in terms of dispute settlement by the World Trade Organization. All of the above principles that we've considered actually are designed to establish and maintain conditions conducive to competition among enterprises of different member states of the World Trade Organization, and to ensure that actually the rules of law prevail in terms of enforcement of trade rules by all member states. So basically, the key aspect that is there is that these principles are established to provide a level playing field in terms of trade. Right, we continue on this one again. Trade-related work in the TBT or TBT-related work actually in the WTO. We need to understand how is the work of the TBT in the WTO. How does actually it affect other members, or what is really the key role of this actually TBT work within the framework of the WTO? TBT-related work in the WTO takes place actually in the TBT committee. There are quite a number of committees that have been established under the WTO. We have actually Committee on SPS, committee of different aspects, but in here we'll be able to actually to take into account the TBT committee. That's our main focus actually for this lecture. So when you look at the TBT committee, which actually responds directly to the Council for Goods in Trade, and it is actually open to all the WTO member states. There is no restriction. All member states actually of the World Trade Organization actually have the right to take part in this actually TBT committee and other representations that may be allowed to be part of that part. And also, we should bear in mind that it falls under the Council for Trade in Good. We can simply say also that the TBT committee affords its members a number of aspects, a number of opportunities. We can say, number one, the TBT committee ensures that there is consultation on matters relating to actually the operations of the TBT agreement. The TBT agreement is driving a factor actually where the TBT committee also actually is enshrined. So it ensures that member states are given that preview within the committee to understand the mechanisms, to understand actually the operations of the TBT agreement. In terms of if there are other members who may want to have a critical or maybe a better understanding of the TBT agreement, the WTO actually through its technical assistance can provide a service just to provide a better understanding for member states actually on the articles that are in the TBT agreement. The opportunity to consult on any matters relating to the furtherance of its objectives that can be found actually in Article 13.1 of actually the agreement. The opportunity to consult any member as well that comes in terms of the understandings of the happenings in the TBT committee. Then also, the other actually aspect that the TBT committee affords its members actually is to carry out such responsibilities as assigned to it under the TBT agreement or the World Trade Organization as a whole in terms of the TBT framework. So again, the TBT committee affords members all those actually privileges. Right. As we conclude, there are a number of questions or just an exercise which actually would be of actually great benefit for members actually to look through, conduct the research on what we've also covered, and also just to apply what we've covered in this actually in this lecture. These questions actually, I'll just echo them out, then responses will come from participants. Then from there, we'll be able to see how best we can share the overview on the exercise. Number one is, how are members of the WTO, I'll be very slow here, to make it actually easy for members or participants to understand. How are members of the WTO to achieve the objectives of the organization? Vis-a-vis, we can say, improve the welfare of the people of its member countries, the standards of living, employment, and income, etc. That's the first question that we need to tackle. Then the second part is, what is the body in charge of the technical barriers to trade? Or may I rephrase this one? Maybe I would say, what is the WTO body in charge of technical barriers to trade matters? To whom does it respond? We've covered this one in this aspect as well, so it's a matter of just recalling, then we push it up. The third question is, what are the assigned tasks to the TBT committee? What are the assigned tasks to the TBT committee? You've just alluded to that one in the few slides that have actually been presented. In addition, and what does it not do? What are the assigned tasks to the TBT committee, and what does it not do, or what doesn't it do? The fourth question is a multiple choice question. A, B, C, D. The WTO provides a framework for member governments. Number one. Two, the WTO provides a framework for member governments too. That's number one, which is A. Agree on global rules applicable to their international trade relations. B. Meet regularly and consider information provided by the members to the WTO. C. Review each member's trade related policies and practices. C or D, settle their trade disputes. E, all the above. Which one is most suitable to question number 4? Question number 5. Which statement correctly represents the national treatment principle in Article 3 of the GATT 1994? Very clear. The question is very clear. We've actually tackled this part. Number 1, which is A, prohibits members from discriminating between like products from different WTO members. Is that so? Silence in terms of responses. We'll mark after each and every individual has responded to. Prohibits members from applying certain internal measures on products of other WTO members. C, prohibits members from favoring their domestic products over imported like or directly competitive products of other WTO member states. D, prohibits members from favoring imported products over their domestic products. E, all the above. These are actually questions that we need to attend to and give a clear-cut reason for each answer that you'll be able to provide. Question number 6. In the WTO, decisions are taken A, by the Director General of the WTO on behalf of the member states. B, by members, by voting only. C, by members, generally by consensus, but voting is possible. D, by members, by consensus at all times. E, none of the above. Again, silence in terms of responses. We'll be able to share as we interact in the next session. That's actually the end of our lecture. I hope you've got some concepts from there that we'll be able to apply in our daily lives, and also by ensuring that our countries or our country is able to provide trade-related aspects, trade measures that will not hinder or inhibit international trade. Thank you so much.